Hello, everybody. Yesterday, I posted a video and a story about early American life, and we talked about the 13 colonies and George Washington, who became our first president. And we talked about a town that was first started in the 13 colonies, Jamestown. And today I'm going to read you a book about another early town in the 13 colonies called Williamsburg. And this book is If You Lived in Williamsburg During Colonial Days. It's a long book, so I'm not going to read every page, but it's kind of neat to learn and see how people lived in the early days of America, and how some people lived poorly and others lived better, and how we're continuing to improve our way of life in America all the time. But this is kind of the beginning of at least the European American experience. So here's the introduction, and here's a little map of the 13 colonies. And I'm going to post a map that you can color of the 13 colonies as well. A lot of you 4, 5, and 6-year-olds know all of your states in the United States, so you'll just be focusing on those eastern states and learning those names because those were the 13 colonies and later the first states in the United States of America. Okay. It's hard to imagine a time when there was no United States, but before 1776, America consisted of only 13 colonies. All of them were in the eastern part of the country, and all of them were ruled by England. The colony of Virginia became the most prosperous of the 13, thanks to its mild southern weather, its rich soil, and its most profitable crop, tobacco. One of Virginia's most bustling towns was Williamsburg. It was named for King William III of England. It started out as a tiny frontier outpost called Middle Plantation. By the early 1700s, it had become the capital of Virginia, and it was renamed Williamsburg. It was known as the showplace of the colonies, and it had a list of prominent citizens and visitors. Suppose you lived a long time ago in Colonial Williamsburg, before America declared independence. What would that have been like? Here's a picture of the town. And then the next picture I wanted to show you and read about is about the market. So we talked a little bit about how they didn't have grocery stores. They went to market. They either grew their food or they went to the market to purchase their food or make trades. So this section is called Who Shopped in Market Square? Housewives came to buy groceries. Slaves came to shop for their masters. Sometimes a few Native Americans would show up to sell pottery. There were always plenty of children of all ages. Baby carriages hadn't been invented yet, so mothers could be seen balancing babies in their arms as they poked at fruits and vegetables to check their ripeness. When you went to market, you might have helped your mother shop or looked after your younger brother or sister. Occasionally, African American people were brought to Market Square for a terrible reason. They were brought to be sold at auction, like they were horses or cows. Imagine how you would have felt if you had seen that. The next part we're going to read about is what people wore. You'll notice that they wore these different hats and their clothes were a little different, and that a lot of them wore wigs, which Riley always thought was kind of interesting. Why would they wear a white curly wig? But it was a sign that they were fancy and wealthy.
And it made them look important.
Yeah, it made them look important. So, baby boys and girls of Colonial Williamsburg were dressed almost alike in kind of a dress that was like a nightgown. Early on, parents began to train their children to stand up straight. As a toddler, you would have been put with a little brace in your clothing that was made out of whalebone, and that made you stand up straight all the time. So even when you were only 3 years old or a little older, a little younger, you would be wearing this brace inside your clothing to help you stand up really straight and have good posture. When a boy was about 4 years old, then he was breeched, and that meant that he graduated from babyhood to boyhood by getting his first pair of breeches, or pants. They came down just below the knees, and the boy dressed like a smaller version of his father, starting at 4 years old. Gentrymen and boys, which were kind of more wealthy men with titles, noblemen, because remember this was still ruled by England. They would wear silk or satin or finer clothes. But if you were poor, your clothes would probably be made of just wool or cotton or linen. And most men and boys did not wear underpants. Instead, they tucked the long tails of their shirts inside their pants. Then came a waistcoat and a hat, and stockings and shoes finished off the outfit. There wasn't much variety. That's really how everyone dressed. The women and girls wore a lot more clothing than you do today. Getting dressed in the morning for a girl was quite a production. It started with your shift, and you wouldn't have worn underwear either. It's likely you already had on your shift because you would wear it to bed. Next, you would change from your nightcap, the one you wore during the night, and put on the one that you wore during the day. Women and girls wore caps all the time. And then you would pull on your stockings. Next came hoops to make your skirt stand out, and then petticoats, and after that, was a short gown or dress, and then often on top of that they wore an apron to cover their clothing when they were working.
They have to be hot and all that.
Yeah, so they had a lot of layers of clothing, and they also had something tied around their ribs to kind of pull your waist in. And I think it was pretty uncomfortable. Here's a picture of them. So they had to be really dressed well every single day. That's how they went to the market. That would be similar to what they would wear if they worked in the fields. They would always wear a dress. So this is kind of showing similar layers of clothing for people who worked more in the field life. And unfortunately, those were usually blacks who had to work in the fields. Here's a picture of them getting fitted for their wigs. And then I wanted to read a little bit about what their houses looked like in the town of Williamsburg. There were a few roughly made wooden houses on the back streets, and some of them had oiled paper in the windows. They didn't even have glass windows. The more up-to-date homes had glass windows, and they were made of brick or painted wood, and they often had an upstairs and a downstairs. None of the houses had electricity, which means they could not flip on a light switch. They would have used candles, so it would have been really dark. Even reading at night would have been hard because they only had the candle. Heat for warmth, staying warm, and for cooking would have come from an open fireplace. They didn't have central heat that kept their house warm. They had to build a fire. And everyone worried about fire because there would have been a bucket handy from the well to put a fire out if it had spread out of your fireplace. That's often why people made homes out of brick if they could afford it, because brick was safer in case of a fire. Many middle families in Williamsburg were farmers. If you came from a farm family, your house would most likely have been at the end of town. That's where there would have been more grass for all your sheep and your cows. If your father was a miller, you can see this picture of the mill, the windmill, then you would have had a windmill on your property to grind up corn and wheat before it was sold. If you were well off, we talked about the gentry or the gentleman people who often still had titles that they had inherited from when they were in England.
Like soul.
Then you might have lived in an elegant mansion with fancy wallpaper and sometimes even up to 8 bedrooms. But one of the things that's unique about America is they slowly moved away from that and said, you don't have to be born into a wealthy, rich family. you could try to work your way up, but only if you were a white man. So that was the thing that was unfortunate about it. And then the lastly is how enslaved people live. Enslaved people who worked in town slept close to the master that they worked for. Some slept in outbuildings, such as the kitchen or laundry, or in the main house, or on a mat outside their farmer's or their master's or mistress's room. Those on farms lived in outbuildings, a little shack, and slaves on plantations often lived in one-room huts called the quarter. And sometimes slaves built a little fence around their house like they remembered from back home in their African villages. So that's a little bit about the way of life in colonial Williamsburg from all different levels of people there, from the enslaved to the poorer farmers to the wealthy British noblemen. And then the Native Americans would have still, for the most part, lived outside of town and kind of tried to keep their own space, their own land, and that would change in the coming years. But thank you for tuning in. As I always say, it's a lot of information, but I think as you start learning about history at a young age, it can make you appreciate it more and want to learn more as you grow older. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon. I miss you all. Bye.